Okay. I guess y'all probably won't talk here. So where did your kids go? Are they all from here?
No, actually.
All right, good morning, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Please keep eating. There's plenty of great food over here. Thank you, everyone. So we have a question for you. This is sort of a little informal poll. Right now we do this informal brunch once a quarter. What we want to know is that too often, too little, just right?
Just
the
right.
way it is?
Just right. Just right.
Okay, we'll take that as a just right.
I wouldn't argue about donuts every Sunday.
Yeah, donuts every Sunday, right. Some classes do that. Yeah, that's true. Okay.
Fattest class.
Well, we're glad Peter and Robin are here with us today with Jordan, their newborn, who's asleep down here. So everyone be quiet. All right. And if you've not yet met Alyssa Topper, this is Alyssa right here next to Pat, married to Jacob, one of our new pastoral residents. And she grew up in that way. Rowlett. I'm catching myself. And she is a physical therapist by vocation. And see, yeah.
I got something right here.
We'll get you introduced around here today. And Jacob, being a resident, is off everywhere during Sunday school, and so we're glad to welcome Alyssa here to check out our class. She's interested in our intergenerational approach to things. And Aaron, would you like to introduce your mother-in-law?
Sure. This is my mother-in-law from England House, originally from Canada.
Wonderful, welcome. So glad to have you with us today. Anyone else here for the first time? I'm looking around the room.
Darrell's back.
Darrell is back. Darrell, it's been a dry spell for a year.
I got promoted.
I have lacked your input in the lessons for the year.
Uh-oh.
And Darrell's been off volunteering with the preschoolers, which I commend. It's a wonderful thing to do, and we need people to do that, right? But Darrell adds a unique voice to our class that we're so excited to have you back as well. Anyone else? We have a lot of things to pray for at the end of our lesson. And so I want to make sure that I stop in time. If we get to 10:35,
Charlene will tell you.
Charlene's going to give me the high sign, and I'm going to shut up at that point. There are things that we do need to pray for today. By way of announcements, tonight you're invited back at 6:30. Hey, guy, come in. You're invited back at 6:30 to hear the poet Christian Wyman in a dialogue session that we're doing down in Community Hall. It's free and ought to be very, very interesting. Has anyone here read any of Christian Wyman's books yet? Did anyone know him beforehand? Yeah, okay. Very good. And he's here actually to speak at Preaching Practicum at the George Baton every year, and that's happening this week as well. Our group from who went to Barcelona is back. We had 8 people in Barcelona, Spain this week on a mission adventure, and glad to have them back. We're saying goodbye to Matthew Broyles today. Blessing time in each service, and then there's reception in James Gallery. If you have not gotten enough food here. Just mosey on over to the gallery, and you can fill that out as well. There's a really cool thing coming up later this month that I want to make sure has caught your attention. It's called the World Vision Experience. And we're really privileged to be able to host this here. It's a touring exhibit that comes in a semi-trailer that opens up from that trailer, but also you go through it. And it is to simulate what it's like to visit another part of the world to understand severe poverty. And it is an interactive kind of deal. And so that will be here the third week of October. And I hope that you'll plan some time to do, if you have older kids or grandkids, like elementary, I would say mid-elementary up, it would be a really moving experience for them too. And there's a way to reflect upon all of that. So pay attention to that coming up as well. Okay. Any other announcements I've forgotten? So we're journeying through the book of 2 Peter, and today we come to 2 Peter chapter 2. And it's my hope that we will cover the entire chapter today because it's all one related whole. And it's also one very difficult related whole. So we will see, well, Siri, I'm not wanting you right now. Okay, I think what I need is, I'd like to get 3 volunteers to read. 1, 2, who's my third? 3, okay? So, Monica, if you start with chapter 2, and let's do verses 1 through, now my iPad's running away from me. Now it's stopped. Okay, let's try this again. If you take verses 1 through 10, well, 10a is what I'm going to call it, yeah. And then, Sherry, if you pick up at 10a, my verse says bold and willful. All right. And then go through 16. And then Hart, if you'd finish 17 through 22. All right? Let's listen now to 2 Peter chapter 2.
But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. And if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority.
Bold and arrogant, these men are not afraid to slander celestial beings, yet even angels, although they are stronger and more powerful, do not bring slanderous accusations against such beings in the presence of the Lord. But these men blaspheme in matters they do not understand. They are like brute beasts, creatures of instinct, born only to be caught and destroyed, and like beasts, they too will perish. They will be paid back with harm for the harm they have done. Their idea of pleasure is to carouse in broad daylight. They are blots and blemishes, reveling, what is it? Reveling, eyes run across, in their pleasures while they feast with you. With eyes full of adultery, they never stop sinning. They seduce the unstable, they are experts in greed and accursed brood. They have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness. But he was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, a beast without speech, who spoke with a man's voice and restrained the prophet's madness.
These are wells without, mine sounds a lot different, reading a lot different, so if
That's
it's
okay.
different, you know.
Go ahead.
These are wells without water, clouds that are carried with the tempest, to whom the mist of darkness is reserved forever. For when they speak great swelling words of vanity, they allure through the lusts of the flesh. Though much wantonness, those that were clean escape from them who live in error. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are the servants of corruption. For of whom a man is overcome, of the same is he bought in bondage. For after they have escaped the pollutions of the world, through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled therein, and overcome the latter is worse with them than the beginning. For it had been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than after they had known it, to turn from the holy commandment delivered unto them. But it happened unto them according to the true proverb, the dog is turned to his own vomit again, and the sow that was washed to her wallowing in the mire.
Yeah. Isn't that exciting?
That's the New King James, so I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's
No, the NIV is just yucky.
yeah, so here's the context. So last week, we finished up talking about chapter 1 of 2 Peter. And chapter 1 is about the righteous person. And chapter 2 is a contrast to chapter 1, talking about false teachers and unrighteousness. So there's a sense in which, if we were doing a scholarly study of this, we might lay out the attributes given in chapter 1, and it would be a nice assignment to compare and contrast them to the attributes laid out in chapter 2, and we would see some parallels in reverse to that. So that's the context to this. Remember that the author of 2 Peter is talking about, right before this, the prophetic message of old and interpretation of that message, and the reference as we begin chapter 2 is to the old times. So chapter 2 verse 1, when it says false prophets also arose among the people, this is a reference to the false prophets in Old Testament times. And if you study the Old Testament, you'll find that it's just full of people claiming to have a word from the Lord who do not actually have a word from the Lord. They have a word from themselves or from someone else within that. And that's a whole other thing we could get off on, but we're not going to do that today. The important thing here is, in chapter 2, verse 1, in the same way, or NRSV says, just as there will be, future tense, will be false teachers among you who will, future tense, secretly bring in destructive opinions. One of the things that's easy to get tangled up on this chapter is just go try to figure out who is being talked about here. Who are these false teachers? Well, there may have already been some false teachers in the early church. Certainly we know that there were along the way. This really serves as more of a warning sign than a description of a particular thing that's going on. It may have had immediate application, but it also really is looking forward. And so the language here is talking about the future tense. There will come among you false teachers, because false teachers, false prophets in the Old Testament have always been among us. There are always those who want to lead you astray. So any important movement is going to have folks who try to spring up and have some variation that they can control. Well, and certainly this is true in religion. We can talk in a moment about some examples of false prophets today as it goes along. But before we get there, there's some really curious language in here and the case that this author makes about understanding this. Now, a cultural thing or two to help us read. One, remember that we said at the beginning of this study that 2 Peter draws a lot from the book of Jude and from other places in the Bible. There's just almost some direct parallelism between 2 Peter and several other places in the New Testament, in the letters, in the epistles. And so this is part of the question on which came first and which one influenced the other. But there's a lot of direct reference out of the book of Jude. 2 Peter also draws references from the Old Testament over and over and over again. We're going to look at a couple of those today. The next thing is that in this ancient world, it was very common to make a really harsh case against your critics. I mean, you think we've got some of that going on in American politics today. That is not a new thing. So one of the cultural things in the Roman world in this time was that if you had an opponent or you were critical of someone, you would work to paint them in the worst possible light, making them appear to be the lowest scum out there. And so there's a sense in which we have to read this writing as coming out of that culture and say, some of the language here may be a bit exaggerated to make a point. That's not saying it's not true, it's just saying it is so harsh. So let's give an example of that. This passage at the very end of the chapter that just made all of you squirm about the hogs, right? There was an idiom in that time that you can't imagine a Jewish person saying, because hogs are unclean, right? And Arkansas had not been invented yet. The idiom was that it was a comparative thing, that someone who couldn't help themselves about something was like trying to give a bath to a pig who would immediately leave the bath and go wallow in some more mud. Because that's what pigs do.
Not according to that advertisement on television where they walk a little pig.
Yeah, they do it on TV now, right? So it was sort of a metaphor, an idiom, to explain the nature of people. And that gets used here and I think illustrates this kind of campaigning nature that this takes on, in which you sort of call up the old shibboleths to make your point about this. Does that make sense? Okay. We can come back and talk about that in a minute. What's more curious at the beginning, and that runs through this, is there's a reference in this chapter to angels. Angels. And there's an assumption implied here that we know a whole lot more about angels than we probably actually do know about angels, or think we know about angels. And it gets a little curious because there are descriptions of what happened, and you may be saying, where's that from? And so I'd like to call your attention to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter, if you have a Bible with you and it has Genesis in it. Sometimes people want to bring New Testaments. Go to Genesis chapter 6. There you go. I upgraded the software on my iPad and everything's not working right now. I hate it when that happens. Chapter 6, verse 1. When people began to multiply in the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, and we probably interpret this as angelic beings of some sort, saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim, anyone know what Nephilim are? Giants. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went into, we're talking about sexual relations here, the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I've created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I'm sorry that I've made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. All right, so that is the background to which the author of 2 Peter is alluding here in a couple of places. And there are other references, and there are just implications on top of those references that get us into what this means. Look at verse 4. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of deepest darkness to be kept until judgment, and if he did not spare the ancient world, even though he saved Noah, and there's the reference we were just at, who was a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood on a world of the ungodly, and if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and so forth. So all of this is a very lengthy argument that's crafted, and I want you to look at the construction of it. It begins in verse 4. For if God did not, and then it goes through all those lists that we just, so forth and so on and so on. And if God rescued Lot, the righteous man, living among them. Then verse 9, it takes us all the way to verse 9 to get to the point. If God did all that, then, this is like a resolution. Wherefore, and wherefore, and wherefore, and wherefore, and be it resolved. All right? Verse 9, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trial, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. The point that the author is trying to make is that these are examples from the past of the ways God has preserved the righteous and condemned the ungodly. Not an unusual theme in the Bible at all. It's sort of a negative roll call of faith, if you will, but it has some curious characters in it. And this whole business about the angels is, I think, a little unsettling and leaves us scratching our heads a bit. So, what do you think about this angel business? How does that resonate with you?
Was that not referencing like the whole thing with Lucifer and?
Yes.
That is what it's referencing?
It is, which is another reference that's one verse. I saw Lucifer fall like...
But then that other thing you just had to read, you're saying that some type of supernatural creatures are having sex with human women?
Yeah.
But that letter to the Noah, I thought it was stuff on earth that was happening that led to the whole Noah.
Well, it was. Yeah, so this is, we could have a whole other study on Genesis chapter 6, which, again, keep in mind this is ancient literature, based in understanding of the time. But the way the explanation is given in Genesis chapter 6 is that the angels were able to interact physically with humans in the early days of creation.
Not unlike the Greek gods.
Not unlike the Greek gods. Yeah. And now, is this a physical reality, or is this an explanation of something else that happened that got passed down? don't know. But that's the reference to this. It almost, this reads a bit like fantasy in Genesis chapter 6. It's spectacular. It's hard for us to understand. But it's such a prominent story that it's carried over into the early church and which means it had a place in the Judaic tradition that led to the birth of the Christian church as well. And we're left to try to figure it out without a complete textbook to know what was going on. What does someone else think about angels and giants?
Well, Mark, I'm confused because it appears that these, in Genesis 6,
Yes.
these were not heavenly angels, these were from someplace else. It's like, were these the ones that had already been cast out?
So this is a great question that Anna's asked. Were these heavenly angels or were these the bad angels? And there are two schools of thought on that. One school of thought is that they, at the time, were good angels, but they became bad angels through this activity. The other is that they are demonic, that they are those who have been cast from earlier. And again, the whole origin of Satan as a fallen angel is supported by about one verse in the Bible. Now, again, it's just not something that the Bible goes into a lot of depth of explaining the origin story on. And we're left to scratch our heads. There are references throughout, and we're trying to figure out what that means. Hart, you had a question?
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Madeline L'Engle, the author.
Yes.
But she wrote a wonderful book called Many Waters. It is a fictional book, but it talks about that very thing, which is the fallen angels who came down with Lucifer, and how they bred with human women, and they were all killed off in the flood, the Great Flood. And so I don't understand that.
And that's a direct reference to Genesis chapter 6.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
10:25. 10:35.
Oh,
I know, I'm kidding.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just-
Wow. 10-minute warning. Wow. Okay.
I do have a comment.
Okay, good.
I've decided, or I studied one time, we're not to worship angels. We're not to pray to angels. So I don't worry about angels.
That was a great segue to exactly what I was about to say. We don't understand this. Let's look at what is the main point being said behind
And I'll
this.
keep pacing.
So having gotten that sort of out there, now let's go back and look at verses 1, 2, and 3. What are the characteristics of false prophets or false teachers? Verse 1, they will secretly bring in destructive opinions. In other words, they will not identify themselves clearly. They will camouflage themselves in some way. Number 2, they will deny the master who bought them. Now this is a reference, of course, to Jesus in this case, but it's a reference to the redeeming work of Jesus as someone who has paid the price for our redemption as slaves. So there is a concept in that day and later days as well, where someone could redeem a person who is sold into slavery and pay the price for them to become free. The illusion here is that this is what Jesus has done for us by paying the price for our sins. And the idea historically is that if such a person does this for you, you are bound in loyalty to that person for the rest of your life. You're not enslaved to them, but we would say today, you owe them a debt of gratitude. And so one of the characteristics of a false teacher or a false prophet is to deny the master who has bought them. So to deny the teachings of Jesus or the divinity of Jesus is one way that we might do this. Next, they will bring swift destruction on themselves. And this is just simply stating that the message of the false teachers ultimately collapses on top of itself and damages them and anyone else who's with them. Verse 2, despite all that, many will follow their licentious ways. Now there's a great word you don't get to use every day. Licentious. Many will follow them. It's easy to want to follow them. And because of these teachers, the way of truth will be maligned. So that's the next proof out of this. The false teachers will lead people into destruction, and they will lead people to malign the way of truth. So that's what makes their message false. And then verse 3, and in their greed, they will exploit you with deceptive words. This is talking about financial gain. That false prophets are motivated often, not always, but often, by some sort of financial gain. They've got a book or a CD or a prayer cloth or whatever they're going to sell you as part of this. And their condemnation, pronounced them long ago, has not been idle, and their destruction is not asleep. In other words, though it looks like they may get through with this and may pull it off, ultimately God will prevail, the truth will prevail, and that's where we go into all that, for if God this, then God will separate the righteous from the ungodly as well. So the question that we've got to deal with, that we may not have time to, but let's take a stab at it, is who are the false teachers? Who, if it says false teachers will come, and I think we would all agree that's very likely, has happened and will happen again, what would you see as characteristics of those in a modern context of false teachers?
I would say anyone that's trying to get money out of people using the gospel or using God or Christ to make money. Like selling something like, you know, if you give me this money, then your son will be healed or whatever. So.
Right. That's a form of manipulation that is, I would agree with that. What's another characteristic we've come up with?
Someone that preaches a message of hate, you know, separatism, we're godly, they're not, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so Talita, I think that's a really interesting point. And I'm glad you said that, because most often when you read commentary on these passages, it's very easy to jump to a really pull-it-in reactionary conservatism on this. That anything that stretches outside our comfort zone is obviously a false teaching. Whereas the opposite is also true, and I think that's what you're pointing out, and that is being too inwardly focused on myself and my wants is also the product of false teaching. It goes both ways. So I was reading a commentary on this where the person writing said, a common application of this today is that there are people out there preaching that you can have your best life now. Anyone get the reference?
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe writing a book and selling it all over about the prosperity gospel. And certainly, the prosperity gospel is just too easy a target for this. I don't want to camp out on that because we could stay there way too long. Pat?
Without causing a lot of hullabaloo, I hope, this verse bothers me in relation to what our church is going through.
Okay.
You know, I just...
Because you fear that we may follow false teaching.
I don't know. I'm just saying it bothers me either way, because there's the thing said for both sides type thing.
Right, right.
And I'm not a separatist in terms of that sort of thing. It's just that, this is a big deal for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a favor, because I think that's a greater answer than I can give in 3 minutes. Could we hold that question and come back to it next week when we're talking about this passage more? I think it's a very great question. And let's make sure we give it full consideration. Because that is a try. I've thought the very same thing in reading this passage. And I think if you're a conscientious Christian, it's a question you're always asking. And I would say that's a sign of spiritual health to be asking that question. It's like that old song about, if you think you're crazy, you probably aren't. It's a good sign, right?
I do think one of the big factors here is that they are basically doing it for their own gain or following. They're turning from the master that bought them or Christ to preach something. Because I think there are some people, whether it would be George or someone that's teaching something much different than George, but they're really teaching that because that's what they believe with all their heart. They're not doing it because it's to bring themselves gain, or they're not doing it to turn their back on Christ. They're doing that because that's what they really believe and they've saw it. In that case, it's not really a false prophet. There may just be, there's some confusion. I mean, there's some things of God that are a mystery that we may not understand on earth. So they're really preaching what they're passionate about and what they feel like God has told them. But if they're not doing it really to do something wrong to wrong God or turn from God in some way, would it still,
Yeah, so before Patrick, let me just say, I could not have said that any better. One of the marks of a false teacher is that they're self-serving. And there is legitimate room for discussion about so much of the Christian life that we need to have, but a false teacher is leading only toward what is profitable for them and what makes them comfortable or happy or content, without regard for the overall message of the gospel and the teaching of Jesus. Does that make sense?
I was just going to say, remind me, I have a good analogy from that next Sunday.
Okay.
On that book that I read, Relativity. Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding. All right, so here's your assignment for this week. As we keep thinking about this, we will pick up our conversation in chapter 2 next week. And I want to encourage you to look around you this week and think of some examples of false teaching, either in our time or in other times in world history that you would find. And let's be prepared to talk about those. And as you read this passage again this week, chapter 2, I would encourage you to read through it again. Think about what are some of the hallmarks of false teaching that are given there, and how might we be guided by those. And here's my warning to you. There are some easy answers that will come to you immediately. As you think about it, try to move beyond the easy answers and dig into some hard answers as well. Because our first inclination about a passage like this is to think of whatever it is that we're against, and that's false teaching. And that's not what this is saying, necessarily. It's not a convenient way to make a case against whoever our opponent is on whatever the issue may be. Now, prayer concerns. I think most